Hello there, boys and girls, and welcome to It's a Shaw Thing. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We're talking some fantasy football today. It's Monday, so we're discussing who's moving on up and who is moving in the wrong direction. Let's start with the quarterbacks this week coming in. Everyone's talking about Eli Manning and Peyton Manning. Oh, Eli Manning's so good. Peyton Manning, not what he used to be. I think we saw his true colors this past weekend. 3 touchdowns, no interceptions for Peyton Manning. This all coming after that big turnaround against Houston. We had those 2 big touchdowns in the comeback win against the Texans. I think Peyton Manning's back, my friends. Weather won't be an issue in his home games. The guy plays in a dome while Eli Manning has to deal with those bad wins at the Meadowlands. So that being said, I think Peyton Manning is back. Marvin Harrison, it's a good sign to see that he was healthy and ready enough to get 2 big touchdowns in that contest. Anthony Gonzalez is an option. Reggie Wayne, one of the elite wide receivers in the NFL. But the most important thing, it's Peyton Manning. This is a guy who's been so good for so long. He comes back from injuries over the offseason, had knee surgery. I think his knees are finally underneath him now. This is a guy who's ready to play. He looked sensational this past weekend. I think this is just the cusp of what's to come. Peyton Manning is moving on up, a great guy to invest in, maybe try to throw a Kurt Warner at someone and see if they bite. All right, next up, a quarterback moving in the wrong direction. Let's go to Oakland. They say Lane Kiffin might have been fired because of his relationship with Jamarcus Russell. He personally didn't believe he should have been the #1 pick overall. Well, let's see what Russell did this past weekend. 13 of 35, 1 interception, no touchdowns, 1 fumble lost, 130-something, 159 yards. Yeah, this is bad. This is really, really bad. Who did he play against? What defense was it? The New Orleans Saints, a team that usually engages in shootouts. Jamarcus Russell was atrocious. Thank goodness for Zach Miller. Otherwise, I don't know what that team would do. They are awful, and Jamarcus Russell so far has to be weighed in as a huge disappointment. This was a game a lot of people expected him to come out and throw for over 200 yards. He's actually considered a decent fantasy option coming into this past weekend. Don't let that happen again. Jamarcus Russell cannot be counted upon. He was horrific. Now on, make sure that he avoids your fantasy rosters at all costs. Now let's talk about the running backs. Everyone concerned about Thomas Jones coming into the weekend of the New York Jets. Has he struggled or has opportunity just eluded him? In my opinion, it is the latter. The fact is that the New York Jets have participated in some shootouts. They didn't really need their running back, but they did want to establish him this past weekend, and I believe they will want to establish him throughout the season. 17 carries, 65 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, a receiving touchdown. You look at him, you look at Leon Washington, an all-purpose back, but at the same time, it's Jones who gets the ball at the goal line. He'll get the points. He'll get plenty of yards as well. He's a consistent option. Don't panic with him. In fact, you might want to buy low right now. It's a great time to do so. As far as those struggling, Joseph Adai, 2 carries, 3 yards. Obviously, yes, he was hampered by an injury. The problem I have is that these injuries do linger. It's a hamstring injury. It perhaps all started because of an ankle injury he had earlier in the season. He had an ailing knee at some point. The fact is that these are connected. If your ankle's sore, you run a little differently. Suddenly you hurt your hamstring. These injuries do happen. They do tend to linger. Joseph Adai might not be back to the back we expected for a couple of weeks. Joseph Adai at this point might be a good guy to try to sell high. Next up, let's talk about the wide receivers. Bernard Berrian came into the season. A lot of people knew what he was. I mean, the guy had 950-plus receiving yards last year. He was a quality wide receiver, but no one anticipated this. The guy has evolved into an elite receiver. Terrell Owens and others struggling these days. This guy is simply rising. Last weekend, 110 receiving yards, a touchdown. This past weekend, 131 receiving yards, a touchdown. I don't care if there's anyone else on that team. I'm surprised Gus Farrar could even manage those yards, but Bernard Berrian is a solid option these days. Maybe not 100+ every weekend, but this guy should eclipse his career high last year. He should get over 1,000 receiving yards and a bunch of touchdowns. Bernard Berrian, a guy you want to invest in. As far as a guy you can't really rely on, Santana Moss. He was #1 wide receiver a couple of weeks into the season, scored touchdowns the first 3 games and had 150+ yards against the Cowboys. The next game, no yards. This past weekend, but 21 yards? This is not a reliable option. This is a guy who had 1,483 receiving yards in 2005 alone. The next year, 790. He hasn't had more than 810 receiving yards since. This is a guy you do not want to invest too much in. Santana Moss, not the player he was in week 1. He has that potential, yes, but he's not going to be consistent. That's the secret about Santana Moss. Well, my friends, that's It's a Shaw Thing for now. We'll talk more fantasy football tomorrow right here at opensports.com.
So you think you can tackle a pro? There's only one way to find out. Click on fantasy at opensports.com.